Welcome to our 6th video on the face of love, in which we're following the Holy Father's papal bull, Misericordia Vultus. And as you'll recall, during the last video, we ended on a little bit of a dour note. The Holy Father was talking especially to those engaged in corruption, really to all of us though in society, and crying out for a personal end to any form of corruption so as to have this encounter of mercy with God. And that brings up a subject that's been in the background ever since the beginning of our discussion. We talk about mercy, but sometimes people can ask, where is justice? Is justice no longer important? And the truth is, mercy and justice are like two sides of the same coin. So the Holy Father is going to engage us now, talking a little bit about the relationship between mercy and justice. And as usual, he begins by bringing us into the Bible. What was the biblical concept of justice? To quote the Holy Father, "It would not be out of place at this point to recall the relationship between justice and mercy. These are not two contradictory realities, but two dimensions of a single reality that unfolds progressively until it culminates in the fullness of love." So justice, first of all, has to be understood in the light of love. Without love, mercy doesn't make sense, and neither does justice. In the Bible, well, first of all, civilly speaking, what is justice? We use the word a lot. I think a lot of times we don't really know what it means. Justice simply means this, that each person in society gets what he deserves. Each person gets what is owed to him. That is just. In the Bible, God is revealed, especially in the Old Testament, repeatedly as being a just God. But what does the Bible mean when we refer to justice? Well, in the Old Testament especially, it has a very special meaning. It means that a just person typically was the man or woman who fulfilled the precepts of the law. So for a Jewish person, from the times of Moses onward, how did you know if a person was truly just? How did you know if a person was following the path of God? Well, the answer was, how does he follow the law? Now there's a danger to that kind of logic. If we follow God's supreme law, which is to love our neighbor as ourselves and to love God above all other things, then we're perfectly fine. But what happens when we get caught up in chasing a whole lot of minutiae, a whole lot of little precepts, trying to follow a whole rule book of indications? That's the danger that the Jewish people repeatedly fell into. That was the danger of the scribes and Pharisees. It turned the law of God, which was a law written to teach us how should we love, into a legalistic kind of a document, a legal code. As long as I'm following this legal code, I'm doing okay. And that's not really what God intended when He gave us the law. In the Bible, what is the proper interpretation of justice? Is not simply the man or the woman who follows all the rules in the law. A just person is the person who abandons themselves to God's will. You can see the concept is very similar, but there's a distinction. It's not simply about fulfilling rules. It's not simply about following precepts. It's about rather saying, I want to be absolutely obedient, absolutely open, absolutely docile to the will of God in my life. That is true justice according to the mind of God. Now Christ brings that to an even higher level. Christ begins, he presupposes that radical abandonment to the will of God in his teachings. And when he argues with the scribes and Pharisees, what he points out to them is this: you have ceased in following all these rules, in following the letter of the law a lot of the times, you have ceased to truly seek to follow the will of God in your personal lives. You have ceased to let Him speak to your hearts and to your consciences, and furthermore, you've taught other people no longer to do so. The appeal that Jesus makes to us, He reaches back to the prophets. One time when He's arguing with the scribes and Pharisees, and they criticize His apostles for, in this occasion, not following the law, eating with unclean hands, Jesus says something to them. Did you never read in the prophet Hosea those words that apply so well to you? I desire love and not sacrifice. Go and understand the meaning of the words. It is love, mercy that I desire and not sacrifice. And you would not have condemned these innocent men. So Jesus teaches us something. What does God want from us? It's not simply to offer up sacrifices every time we've done something bad. Not simply, in the days of Christ, to offer up, to burn an animal or to offer up some sort of sacrifice to God because I've done something bad. It is mercy that the Father truly deserves. Now, I think this applies also to you and to me, because Christ has given us sacraments. The Church's greatest gifts to us are sacraments. But we can also become legalistic in the way that we approach these sacraments if we're not careful. Sometimes we can get very legalistic about coming to confession all the time. We know that we've committed a sin, we know that we have a habit of sin, and we come to confession, and that's a good thing. We need those confessions. But are our confessions always part and parcel of a desire to convert our lives? Do I couple that sacramental confession with at least a desire and a resolution to extend mercy, to learn how to love more, to learn how to not only receive the mercy of God in Him pardoning my sins, but in imitating the mercy of God, in being an instrument of the mercy of God, and extending the mercy of God to others? When we open ourselves up that way, that is when those sacraments are really going to transform us. That's what God is looking for in you and me. He wants us to be instruments of His mercy. Mercy and not sacrifice. This is where Christ really teaches us then that mercy is at the center of His teaching. If we're going to be a Christian, a follower of Christ, then we have to be men and women who extend mercy to the world. Now, years later, there was a person by the name of Paul, St. Paul, and this was his experience. He began as the most legalistic person imaginable. Even among scribes and Pharisees, Paul was legalistic. Paul was hard of heart. Paul was driven by a zeal for the law, and a zeal to follow the letter of the law perfectly and to the smallest detail, and to make sure that everybody else followed the letter of the law perfectly and to the smallest detail. And he thought that in doing that, this was how he would glorify God. And it wasn't until he had an experience with the living God on that road to Damascus, where he experienced mercy himself, where God revealed to him how wrong everything he was doing was, and nonetheless did not wipe him out, did not annihilate him. God revealed his wrongness in an act of mercy. That encounter with the mercy of God transformed the heart of this zealous Pharisee into one of the greatest ministers of mercy, one of the greatest apostles of all time. And that changed Paul's entire way of thinking about life. He no longer viewed God's justice as being simply fulfilling mercy. From this point onward, Paul understood it is not legalistic justice that God is looking for. Paul understood real justice, God's justice, as being embracing the faith that God plants into our heart. Again, to embrace faith, it's the same language basically that the popes have been speaking about. It is to open our hearts, as Pope Francis says, to hear the word of the Father and to be willing to do it. This transformed everything in Paul's life. And again, to quote Pope Francis in number 20 of Misericordia Vultus, he says the following: Paul's understanding of justice changes radically. He now places faith first, not justice. Salvation comes not through the observance of the law, but through faith in Jesus Christ, who in his death and resurrection brings salvation together with a mercy that justifies. God's justice now becomes the liberating force for those oppressed by slavery to sin and its consequences. God's justice is his mercy. See, this is what Christ does for us. We no longer really oppose mercy on one hand and justice. Because of Christ, Paul was able to understand God's justice is his mercy. God's mercy is his justice. That's not easy to understand. So I think it's important. This is where I'm going to frankly follow the text of Pope Francis a little bit, because he's a clearer thinker than I am. But we can put it this way. Mercy is God's way of reaching out to you and to me, to the sinner, so that we can convert. God is never merciful just to say, you know what, your sins really don't matter. I'm just going to forget about it. Keep living the same life. That's not mercy. That is not mercy. That is a God who does not care. Our God is somebody who cares infinitely. Our God is a God who is willing to become a human being, to become a man, to be tortured to death, and to give his life for us. So much did he care. Our God is a God who says, I want you to experience my mercy so that you can convert. And in converting, you will be just. When you convert, you will live the just kind of a life that I want you to live. And from that moment onward, you will be a whole man, a whole woman. Going back to the prophets, Pope Francis points out something from the prophet Hosea. And it's interesting because Hosea lived in a time when Israel was really at perhaps its lowest point morally. It was already starting to be taken apart piece by piece by other kings as punishment for their abandoning God. And Hosea prophesies, says, the people of Israel shall not return to the land of Egypt, and Assyria shall be their king. So he already tells them, you're not going to escape. The kingdom of Assyria is going to come in and conquer you because they have refused to listen to me. So it sounds like here is God condemning Israel, and he is. God is pointing out, you have sinned, there is justice, there will be consequences. As clear as could be. But immediately afterwards, what does God say through the prophet? He completely changes his tone. The very next line, God says, how can I give you up, O Ephraim? How can I hand you over, O Israel? How can I make you like Admah? How can I treat you like Zeboim? My heart recoils within me. My compassion grows warm and tender. I will not execute my fierce anger. I will not again destroy Ephraim. For I am God, not man, the Holy One in your midst, and I will not come to destroy. It's interesting, even when God is announcing there's going to come punishment, immediately he tells us why. I am allowing there to be punishment. I'm allowing there to be purification because I want you back. And this punishment will not lead to your destruction. I cannot forget you, and I cannot abandon you to stay in your sin. I need you to become pure and holy like you used to be. I want you to become the best possible version of yourself. And that is why God allows his justice sometimes to step into our lives, because as an act of mercy, he wants us to have purified hearts. Pope Francis continues, if God limited himself to only justice, he would cease to be God. Think about that. If God limited himself to only justice, he would seek to be God. and would instead be like human beings who ask merely that the law be respected. You see, you and I are very good about simply wanting to follow rules because it makes us comfortable. We can understand rules. We can manipulate rules. We can consider ourselves to be good people as long as we follow the rules. But God knows better. God knows what is in our heart. This is why God goes beyond justice with his mercy and forgiveness, the Pope continues. Yet this does not mean that justice should be devalued or rendered superfluous. On the contrary, anyone who makes a mistake must pay the price. However, this is just the beginning of conversion, not its end. So the Pope goes back to reaffirm something. Mercy does not do away with justice. You do something wrong, there's always a price. You do bad action, there's always a consequence. Somebody has to pay. And in justice, that person should be you. But God is not erasing justice through his mercy, but he is allowing his justice into our lives for conversion. And he's allowing mercy very often to be the very first thing that we experience in our lives, so that we ourselves will take up the process of changing, of becoming just, and in the process then of also making amends for those bad things that we have done. God's justice is his mercy given to everyone as a grace that flows from the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Thus, the cross of Christ is God's judgment on all of us and on the whole world, because through it, he offers us the certitude of love and new life. God's justice is his mercy. It means, we said earlier that justice means to give to each person what is his due. Well, the moment that God chose to create you and me in his own image and likeness, what is our due? We are worth an infinity. And the moment again that Christ chose to redeem us in his own blood, what is due to us? You and I are worth the very blood of Christ. So God cannot give us, if he is a just God, that which would not be just. God has to be just. And he knows that you and I are worth the blood of Christ. What does that mean for you and me? Whenever we see our neighbor, whenever we see the people outside there, whenever we see our friends in the church, everybody that you and I see has been purchased by the life of Christ. And every one of those people is worth the life and the death of Jesus. God bless you all.